Hello and thanks for taking the time to check out this video. Today we're going to be doing a somewhat condensed crash course on the G3 family of rifles, specifically geared towards individuals who are relatively new in their interest to the platform or just generally want to learn more about it. We're going to be covering the history and operational characteristics of the weapon and trying to fairly address some of the pros and cons of the system. Finally, I'm going to try to offer some realistic expectations for individuals who might be considering adding such a roller-delayed blowback battle rifle to their own collection. As usual, a few of my own personal opinions and experiences are going to be peppered in throughout. Without further ado, let's dive right into the history of the G3. Like many modern military firearms, the G3 traces its lineage to the Second World War. For 6 brutal years, the bulk of the human race turned its attention to warfighting, and small arms development was flooded with unprecedented industrial and intellectual might. Unsurprisingly, this crucible of resources, combat experience, and dire necessity ignited a renaissance in firearm design, and an enduring paradigm shift ensued, on a scale which had not been seen since the advent of smokeless powder some half-century prior. Among the most groundbreaking weapon systems fielded in the apocalypse that was the European theater was the German Sturmgewehr, designed by Hugo Schmeisser. In addition to being the progenitor of all modern assault rifles, a category which, by the way, is literally defined by the English translation of Sturmgewehr, the STG offered unprecedented combat capabilities in a carbine-sized package. Originally adopted as the STG-44, also known by the designations MP-43 and MP-44, Nazi weapon designers sought to improve Schmeisser's design by reducing its weight, cost, and complexity of manufacture. Additionally, the traditional gas-operated action of the STG was to be replaced with cutting-edge roller blowback delayed technology, which, by the way, is actually kind of funny unintentional pun if you know anything about the significance of cutting certain edges in a roller delayed blowback system. I digress. By the end of the war, the updated STG-44 mic was still in the developmental phase, and limited numbers of prototype actually saw production. To make a long story short, a Nazi engineer by the name of Ludwig von Grimler was caught in the human capital flight following the collapse of the Third Reich, and was recruited to continue development of the STG-45 mic and roller-delayed blowback concepts in general for the Western powers. After more than 5 years of work, von Grimler ultimately won the favor of the Spanish government with development of the Modelo II prototype rifle in December of 1950. In a deeply ironic twist of fate, it was actually the new West German Bundesgrenzschutz and Bundeswehr which were ultimately willing to invest in the Modelo II, driving the development of the CETME Modelo A and finally the CETME Modelo B, all of which were increasingly refined variations of the original STG-45 mic design. It should be noted that for virtually the entirety of the developmental process, from the STG-45 mic to the CETME Modelo A, the weapon was insightfully chambered in an intermediate or at least low-powered rifle cartridge. Unfortunately, with the sobering reality of combat less immediately apparent, the newly formed North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, ultimately succumbed to bureaucratic and committee-driven decision-making and insisted on the standardization of the dubiously overpowered 7.62 by 51 millimeter cartridge, basically just 30-06 M2 ball in a smaller case. The particulars of this decision and its larger implication, not just for the G3, but for many other iconic Cold War NATO small arms, is a fascinating subject of discussion. However, that would be content for another video. In any case, the CETME Modelo B, now chambered for 7.62 NATO, would go on to be formally adopted by Spain as the Modelo 58, and more significantly by West Germany as the Gewehr III or G3. By January of 1959, West Germany had acquired licensing and production rights for the platform, and domestic German production started at the iconic German defense contractor Rheinmetall, as well as a fledgling corporation operating under the name Heckler and Koch. 15 years since its genesis, the STG-45 mic developmental cycle had finally reached its end and had found its way back home to Germany along the way. Between the G3's adoption and the modern day, the platform has experienced enormous success. While it hasn't always enjoyed the same prestige and celebration as some of its immediate competitors, such as the Belgian FAL or the American M14 and AR-10, it actually exceeded all three in terms of production numbers. By most estimates, it's tied with the M1 Garand for being the fourth most produced autoloading rifle in history, with about 8 million units manufactured for each. Those numbers are only exceeded by the most successful rifle platforms of all time. The AR-15 M16 is at second, actually. At first is going to be the Kalashnikov family, and at third is the Simonov carbine, or the SKS. Furthermore, the G3 saw some degree of adoption by at least 85 countries and has seen active use in more than 35 wars since its inception. While originally a weapon of choice for anti-communist forces, the G3 and its merits have come to be appreciated by all sides of the social and political spectrum. Although a unified Germany ultimately replaced the G3 with the G36 in the 1990s, there are still developed nations which issued G3 variants to frontline and even special operation combat soldiers to this day. Finally, the G3 served as the foundation upon which Heckler and Koch ultimately grew into one of the largest firearms manufacturers and distributors in the world, and it also served as the mechanical basis upon which a scaled-down 9mm version grew into possibly the most iconic submachine gun in history, which is the MP5.
So that's the history of the G3. Let's go ahead and talk about what it actually is. The G3 is a select-fire battle rifle chambered in the 7.62 NATO cartridge. Standard configurations include an 18-inch barrel and have a base weight of approximately 9.5 to 10 pounds with an overall length just north of 40 inches. It's fairly handy for a battle rifle, yet its overall dimensions and capabilities are pretty equivalent with those of its most immediate contemporaries and competitors, the FNFAL, the U.S. Ordnance M14, and the Armalite Rifle 10. It is a relatively simple design, and its basic components include a buttstock, a recoil assembly, a detachable trigger housing and fire control group, a welded sheet metal receiver, a bolt assembly, and a barrel assembly, which includes a handguard and non-reciprocating charging handle. Remember, the G3 operates on a roller delayed blowback and therefore has no gas system, a unique feature setting it apart from its peers. Also, rather distinct is the G3's fluted chamber, a design feature which imparts distinct gas flow marks on fired cases, as well as helps the weapon digest a healthy diet of brass or steel-cased ammunition, typically fed from a 20-round steel or aluminum magazine.
Other variations of the G3 include models with shortened barrels, modified furniture, optics mounting capabilities, and longer and/or thicker barrel profiles. Some of the most enduring and compelling iterations of the G3 are versions specifically modified for designated marksman or sniper roles, such as the highly successful PSG-1. So let's talk about the actual operation of the G3, and more specifically how it stacks up against other battle rifles of its day. Despite the enormous success and unrivaled production numbers of the G3, there are actually quite a few real drawbacks to the system, even compared to its contemporaries. The ergonomics of the G3 leave a lot to be desired. The buttstock in particular is an ergonomic nightmare with a 14+ inch length of pull and a deep swoop which takes the butt pad well outside of the line of recoil. This exaggerates the already stout jolt of the 7.62mm NATO cartridge. The non-reciprocating charging handle is positioned near the front of the handguard and requires significant time and strength in order to operate. The fact that the weapon lacks a bolt hold open feature further compounds that issue and ensures that operators have little opportunity to bypass this prolonged and temporarily incapacitating reloading process. Magazine insertion can be relatively difficult on a closed bolt, and the safety lever, while not necessarily unergonomic, is somehow stiff and mushy at the same time. Lastly, the triggers on G3s are uniquely awful, typically heavy, creepy, and generally not conducive to precision shooting. In summary, the rifle demands a surplus of strength, dexterity, and patience in order to run effectively and is anything but efficient. Another drawback includes the rifle's tendency to overheat in the handguard region, although there's a number of field expedient solutions to this particular issue, the most obvious of which is wearing a glove. Finally, it must be noted that while the G3 is a select fire rifle, the recoil forces generated under fully automatic fire are substantial enough to render the rifle all but useless. That said, this really shouldn't be held against the G3, as this is an issue fully shared by its battle rifle contemporaries and reflects NATO's insistence on the 7.62 NATO cartridge rather than any flaw or design with any specific model. As a related tangent, however, this is a positive point for American civilian firearms owners, as it means that while our Title I semi-auto only G3s are not necessarily mechanically accurate, they are practically accurate in terms of real-world functionality and application. So obviously that's a lot of downsides, and surely there's others still that I either forgot or didn't have time to include in this video. So I'm sure some of you are asking, what's good enough about the G3 that got 8 million units produced? Why do I care enough about this platform to make a video? And there's a few ways to answer that question. First, I'll say this. Anyone who knows anything about military combat-intended firearms knows that there's a characteristic which we haven't talked about yet, which is more important than anything we have talked about, and that's reliability. A sledgehammer that works is better than a machine gun that doesn't work. And the G3 is a sledgehammer of a battle rifle. It is not elegant, it is not ergonomic, and it is not fast, but it is simple, it is lethal, and it works under a wide range of conditions. The violent, heavy recoil and action of the G3 blasts through grit and debris and is not sensitive to environmental conditions. The lack of a gas system eliminates the need for gas setting adjustments, regardless if the operator finds themselves in the sweltering jungles of Rhodesia or on the frozen peaks of the Hindu Kush. Failure points are fairly limited, and remedial action is intuitive. Comparisons with the stamped steel AKM are hard to ignore, and I find it neither cliche nor exaggerative to consider the G3 as the AK of battle rifles. Neither weapon could ever claim to be the slickest, smoothest, or fastest on the battlefield. Neither weapon was developed with electronic optics, IR designators, and 21st century mission sets in mind, and in fact both have experienced very real obstacles in conforming to these modern realities. The thing is, however, they're both simple, they both meet the fundamental capability requirements of a combat rifle, and they work extremely well under virtually all conditions. I believe that no firearm which is simple, capable, and reliable should ever be underestimated, and I think history has proven that pretty decisively in this case. So with that out of the way, it should be noted there are a couple other real advantages with the G3. For one, the lack of a gas system creates the opportunity for extremely precise shooting, while standard issue ammunition, mediocre barrel harmonics, a somewhat inaccurate rear drum sight, and an exceptionally uninspired trigger mechanism generally conceal this accuracy potential from the average infantryman. There are modified G3 rifles which successfully exploit it. Aftermarket modifications such as the spool adjustable stock, custom triggers, modified barrel assemblies, and simple optics mounting solutions, predominantly welded Picatinny rail or H&K style claw mounts, pretty much eliminate the drawbacks of the G3 and do put it on par with 21st century competitors. Hence why we still do see such G3s being used by European Special Operations Forces as recently as 2021 before the pullout from Afghanistan. Really, the only drawbacks to the G3 that can't be fixed with money and parts replacement is the inefficiency of the charging and reloading of the rifle and the uncontrollability of full auto fire. Both problems, I think, are easy to overestimate in terms of their significance. Well, most people these days are willing to admit that a squad-level rifleman, a grenadier, team leader, or designated marksman really doesn't need full auto capability. I would argue that the necessity of rapid reloads is also sometimes overstated, at least for conventional troops. Despite some popular opinions, modern combat is not a two-way three-gun match, and the difference between a half-second reload and a 5-second reload is not necessarily the difference between winning and losing a gunfight. None of that is to say it doesn't matter, obviously, as it does. After all, as we covered in the history section, the entire G3 platform was born out of the lessons of World War II, which could be summarized to say that every edge you can give your troops in terms of small arms performance does matter. My only point here is that until we see the next leap forward in terms of small arms technology, I don't see the G3 disappearing from the battlefield. It's certainly not the most cutting edge thing out there, but at 60 plus years of age, it is still very capable of conforming to modern operational parameters. All right, so now we've gone over history as well as the military application and pros and cons of the system. So let's go ahead and answer the final question, which might be on some people's minds, which is, should you buy one? Obviously, that's a fairly personal question that at the end of the day only you can answer, but perhaps as the owner of a couple of G3 platform rifles, I can be of some help in getting you on the right track to making that decision for yourself. So why might you want to buy a G3? Immediately apparent to me, there's 3 reasons. First, you might want a G3 for purely historical collecting purposes. If that's the case, I would highly encourage you to proceed and get one. As I've previously established, the G3 is a weapon platform of enormous historical significance and is one of the most recognized weapon systems across the globe. While for whatever reason it hasn't enjoyed some of the critical acclaim that, say, the FAL has, it truly deserves recognition alongside peers of equal significance, such as the 1898 Mauser and the M1 Garand and the AK. For historical purposes, I would advise individuals to start with a relatively accurate clone, such as the PTR 91 or 101 series, with the 18-inch barrel, with the tapered profile. And from there, once they've got that, maybe they can explore building specific iconic variants, get a short-barreled G3K version, or even a Swedish AK-4. If down the road you catch a wild hare, you might consider breaking out the green rattle can and doing yourself up a facsimile Rhodesian build, or if you have a particularly accommodating budget, you might consider purchasing a Springfield imported SAR-3 or even a early import HK-91, which would be considered the premier G3 type rifles on the US civilian market. So a second reason to purchase a G3 would be for purely recreational use. And if that's the case, I think that can be a great idea. G3s can be a lot of fun at the range, and sometimes they can be a bargain. It's 2021, so that sentence is less true than it's ever been, but historically they have been, and possibly they could be again. While prices are obviously climbing industry-wide at alarming rates, I can recommend the Century Arms Gen 2 C308. That is the weapon you see pictured on my right, your left, and I do have an individual video on that, possibly multiple at this time. So if you're interested in that, you can probably check those out. The PTR series, which you'll see to my up and also your up, is another great option. Those are going to be more in the $1,000 range, whereas these used to be had for in the about $500-600 range. They've gone up. These have stayed pretty true right around $1,000. It's also worth noting that HK aluminum and CETME steel surplus magazines can still be purchased for very good prices in a lot of places, as little as a couple dollars a piece. And when compared to a SCAR, an M1A, or even a higher quality FAL magazine, that's a really good bargain. And if you're like me and you like to have a lot of magazines for your particular weapon systems, you can save a lot of money going with a G3 style weapon over something else simply based on buying magazines. Finally, it's worth noting that G3 type rifles are famously not very picky about ammo. So as long as you're not really trying to push too far past 300 or trying to shoot the tightest groups possible, cheaper cased steel 308 ammo is going to run just fine out of your G3 rifle. My only caution to recreational shooters would be an honest self-assessment of your physical strength and size when it comes to operating a G3. I previously described the G3 as a sledgehammer of a battle rifle, and I meant that in more ways than one. The G3 is a very manly rifle, for lack of a better term, and requires you to get your hands dirty and work out a little bit in order to operate it properly. You don't need to be a giant or a bodybuilder to run one. Obviously, I am neither of those things. But you should be aware if you're a small-statured shooter, a shooter lacking upper body strength, or a shooter who doesn't necessarily have confidence on serious military battle rifles, and that's what this is, it may not be quite as much fun for you to shoot, at least at first. So again, my recommendations for recreational shooters would probably be, again, these two that you see, and that is the category I would put myself in, at least in relationship to this rifle, so it shouldn't be a surprise that these are what I have currently. And this is going to be the Gen 2 C308 from Century and the PTR 91 GIR. I believe they market that under the 101 GIR currently. I would not recommend and cannot endorse the C91 or the Gen 1 C308 unless you have the opportunity and you feel confident evaluating that firearm for safety and function prior to purchase. Finally, there's surely a subsection of shooters who are interested in the G3 as a practical firearm for defense of person and property or some theoretical social cataclysm. I do think that is a legitimate manner of thinking and is actually quite prudent, so long as it doesn't stray too far into the realm of fantasy, such that it distracts from participation in the world we do live in currently. I digress. As a general rule, I would discourage people from purchasing a G3 type rifle for tactical or practical purposes. First, I think you can do better for the money. We still live in the golden era of AR-15 availability, and I'm pretty sure there aren't any regions in the US that'll let you have a G3 and not an AR. So I would question why you wouldn't go with the most popular and best platform in the country, which is the AR. If for whatever reason you made a personal decision that you want to go with a full power battle rifle instead of or in addition to an intermediate rifle, totally understandable. I would still suggest that you can do better than the G3 for the money, probably again in the form of a Eugene Stoner design, the AR-10. In terms of quality relative to cost, parts compatibility, aftermarket support, and general function, I do believe that commercial AR-10s are going to be a better bet than commercially available G3s. Even a Springfield M1A, I personally believe, is a compelling alternative when you're talking about serious use, at least if we're looking at commercially available G3s in the form of a Century or a PTR gun, which are good, but they're not military grade, if that makes any sense. I would consider them very good for what they are, but these didn't come out of factories that have ever won a military contract, so do keep that in mind. I would give the edge back to the G3 if we're talking about something like an SAR-3 or an HK91. However, those these days come at prices which introduce a whole new class of competitors, such as the Galil Ace and 308 and the FN Scar. So I do believe any way you slice it, if you're going with a commercially available G3 as a practical firearm, I am a little curious or doubtful of the motivations on that one. Now that said, of course, there are going to be exceptions to that recommendation, two of which jump out at me immediately. If you are in the very small subsection of Americans who happen to have military training and possibly even combat experience with the G3, presumably serving in a foreign military, that's obviously a serious consideration. I don't need to tell you that. I'm personally aware of at least one older gentleman who served in the German Luftwaffe. I think that's what they call the non-Nazi Air Force, the German Air Force, whatever they call it now, the new one that doesn't have the little red squiggles on the side. And understandably, that gentleman does prefer the G3 based on his familiarity and comfort with it, which I totally understand. Finally, if you already happen to own a G3 and you verified that it functions to a standard at which you are comfortable, I would not discourage you from using it for practical purposes. If it's what you have, then I think that you're a whole lot better off than you could be, that's for sure. Instead, I would suggest investing in basic upgrades, such as an inline stock and a quality optic, obviously sling and light go without saying as well, which, as previously established, should give you a firearm capable of at least keeping up with today's latest and greatest. Speaking for myself personally, I can say that the rifles you see here today, I value them. They're very appreciated parts of my collection. However, they are more range toys and objects of historical reference and just personal fascination for me. I don't take them lightly. These two are extremely capable weapon systems. I've shot them a lot and I know that. But if I were to engage in speculation of residing in a world where my civilian life required me to keep and use military arms in earnest, these would not be my first two choices. All right, thanks. That's today's video. I hope somebody out there learned a thing or two, or at least found it interesting. If you did, I'd greatly appreciate a thumbs up, if for no other reason than I know that somebody did benefit from it, and I'm not just purely talking to myself in my house right now. If you have any questions, comments, things you think I got wrong, or suggestions for things I can do better in the future, I would greatly appreciate you taking the time to leave those in the comments. And of course, this is YouTube, so if you want to do your part to contribute to the downfall of civility in our time, get down there, get weird, get personal, vent your frustrations onto me, and let me know that you think I'm an idiot. I'm there for you. And other than that, thanks again so much, and hopefully I'll catch you in the next one.